Welcome, we're continuing our journey through Daniel chapter 11, and in this video we'll be covering verses 25 to 26. Before we launch into these verses, let's just take a step back and remember where we've been so far. So Daniel 11 has been recording with amazing accuracy the multiple Syrian wars between the Seleucids in the north and the Ptolemies in the south. There are a total of 6 Syrian wars between these empires, and so far in our journey we've covered the first 5 of them. In this video we'll be going through the 6th and final Syrian war, but before we do that, let's remind ourselves what happened in the preceding 5th Syrian war. So in 202 BC, the 5th Syrian war begins between Antiochus III and the child king Ptolemy V. At the Battle of Panium, Antiochus has a decisive victory and recaptures Israel for the Seleucid Empire. This piece of land in our historical sources is referred to as Seleucid Syria. So at the end of the 5th Syrian war, Antiochus has captured this land for the Seleucids. Now, having conquered this land, Antiochus wants to continue his expansion and capture Egypt itself. But he fears the Romans who are supporting the Ptolemies. So what does Antiochus do? Well, Antiochus has 3 important children, Seleucus IV, Antiochus IV, and Cleopatra I. So he gives his daughter Cleopatra in marriage to Ptolemy as a peace agreement to end the 5th Syrian war. In actuality, he does this to infiltrate the Ptolemaic Empire, but it doesn't work. Cleopatra becomes loyal to Ptolemy V. Now, Cleopatra and Ptolemy then go on to have 3 important children of note as well, this being Ptolemy VI, Cleopatra II, and Ptolemy VIII. Now, once Ptolemy V dies, his eldest son, Ptolemy VI, takes the throne. But since he's still very young at this stage, his mother acts as regent. As Newsom notes in her commentary, quote, from 180 to 176, the widowed queen Cleopatra had been regent for her son, Ptolemy VI Philometor, end quote. Then, once Cleopatra dies, since Ptolemy is still very young, they bring in officials to be regent for the boy. Quote, after her death, the regency of the still underage child passed to 2 members of the court, Iulius, a eunuch and former tutor of Ptolemy VI, and Leanos, a slave of Cleopatra's household, who oversaw the kingdom's finances, end quote. Another important thing to consider is that during this time period, Ptolemy VI is not the only ruler of Egypt. As Newsom continues to write, quote, they also made Ptolemy VI's sister Cleopatra II his queen and consort, and in 170 added their younger brother Ptolemy VIII Physcon as the 3rd regent, end quote. So while Ptolemy VI has the lead position, his younger siblings are also considered regents alongside him. Okay, let's pause here for a moment and remember that up in the north, Antiochus III is no longer king, it is now Antiochus IV. It's also really important to know that during this time period, the Seleucids and Ptolemies are related. Because remember, the mother of the Ptolemies was Cleopatra I, whose brother is Antiochus IV, as they are both children of Antiochus III. So this means that Antiochus IV is the uncle to the current kings and queen of the Ptolemaic Empire. Now, the reason why this is important is because when Ptolemy VI is crowned king, Antiochus sends an official, Apollonius, to represent the Seleucid Empire, since it's his nephew being coronated. But when Apollonius is down in Egypt, he hears rumors that Ptolemy is getting ready to invade Antiochus. The reason for this planned invasion is because the Ptolemies are upset that they lost control of Seleucid Syria during the 5th Syrian war. So the Ptolemies want to recapture this land, therefore they're getting ready for war. We read this in 2 Maccabees chapter 4. Quote, when Apollonius, son of Menthus, was sent to Egypt to attend the crowning of Ptolemy VI Philometor as king, Antiochus learned that Ptolemy VI Philometor was opposed to his policies. Antiochus became concerned about the security of his own kingdom, end quote. So Ptolemy VI has started to gather forces at the border known as Pelusium for an invasion of the Seleucid Empire. Liang Xiao, in his commentary, writes about these events, quote, Antiochus's envoy, a man by the name of Apollonius, sent to represent the Seleucids at the coronation of Ptolemy VI Philometor in Egypt, noted strong anti-Seleucid sentiments in the Ptolemaic court. And Antiochus himself later complained to Rome of Egyptian aggressions against him, Polybius 27:19. When we read Polybius's account, 27:19, we read the following, Antiochus, seeing that at Alexandria preparations were being made for war concerning Syria, sent Malanga as his envoy to Rome with orders to inform the Senate and protest that Ptolemy was entirely unjust in attacking him. End quote. Now Rome doesn't send any help, so Antiochus takes matters into his own hands, and this begins the 6th Syrian War. So with all this background information now, we can finally get into verse 25 of Daniel, which reads, quote, "He, the king of the north, shall stir up his power and determination against the king of the south with a great army. The king of the south shall wage war with a much greater and stronger army, but he, the king of the south, shall not succeed, for plots shall be devised against him." End quote. Okay, so the first thing that we should notice here is that the verse says that it's the king of the north, Antiochus, who is the one who stirs up the power and determination against the king of the south. But based on our background knowledge of these events, this is not the case. It was rather Ptolemy who initiated this conflict, as he was the one gathering troops at the border. Siao writes in his commentary, quote, "Manifesting an anti-Seleucid bias, the narrator presents Antiochus as the aggressor against Egypt, the one who, quote, stirs up his power and determination against the king of the south with a great army," end quote. So obviously the author of Daniel really hates Antiochus IV and therefore has portrayed him as the aggressor. And our other Jewish accounts of this event, who likewise despise Antiochus, present him as initiating the war as well. Siao continues to write, "This view is supported by other Jewish sources, 1 Maccabees and Josephus' Antiquity of the Jews." Newsom also writes of these events, quote, "It was the Ptolemaic army, however, that first initiated hostilities, though it was swiftly met and defeated by the Seleucid army while it was still in the Sinai desert, not far from Pelusium." End quote. And this is exactly what verse 25 tells us. "But he, the king of the south, shall not succeed." Newsom continues to write, "Antiochus restrained his army from massacring the defeated Ptolemaic forces, which retreated." End quote. We read of Antiochus's decisive victory at Pelusium in several of our historical sources. Most of them note that Antiochus showed great restraint and decided not to massacre the Egyptians at this battle. Diodorus writes, quote, "Though Antiochus was in a position to slaughter the defeated Egyptians, he wrote about calling to his men not to kill them, but to take them alive. Before long, he reaped the fruits of his shrewdness, since this act of generosity contributed very greatly to his seizure of Pelusium and later to the acquisition of all Egypt." End quote. Josephus likewise notes, quote, "Now Antiochus, upon the agreeable situation of the affairs of his kingdom, resolved to make an expedition against Egypt, both because he had a desire to gain it, and because he condemned the son of Ptolemy as now weak and not yet of abilities to manage the affairs of such consequence. So he came with great forces to Pelusium and circumvented Ptolemy Philometor by treachery and seized upon Egypt." End quote. So great was Antiochus's victory at this battle, he is able to take control over a large amount of Egypt. So this is an absolutely humiliating defeat for the Ptolemies. Verses 25 and 26 of Daniel actually give us a reason for this enormous defeat. Quote, "But he, the king of the south, shall not succeed, for plots shall be devised against him by those who eat the royal rations. They shall break him, his army shall be swept away, many shall fall slain." End quote. So note here that the reason for this disastrous loss is blamed on those who, quote, "eat the royal rations." Well, who does this refer to? Well, those who eat the royal rations obviously refers to the inner circle of Ptolemy VI, those who sit down and eat with him. And it's specifically referring to Julius and Lianus, who we spoke of before. They were the regents put over him because he was still a young boy. In his commentary, Siao writes the following, quote, "The text here alludes to the bad advice that he, Ptolemy VI, was receiving from the anti-Seleucid courtiers, specifically two men known from our other historical accounts, the eunuch Julius and the Syrian Lianus, among those who eat of the royal rations." End quote. Now, this is yet another example of Daniel 11 perfectly aligning with our historical sources, as our other historical accounts of this event blame the Ptolemaic loss on the poor advice and strategy of Ptolemy's inner circle. Diodorus writes the following, quote, "The ministers of the young Ptolemy, Julius the eunuch, and the Syrian Lianus resorted to every possible means and device. What is more, the men who undertook these great tasks were completely without experience of warfare and battles. They lacked even a single competent advisor or capable commander. They themselves, as might be expected, soon met with the punishment that their folly deserved, and they brought the kingdom to utter ruin as far as it was in their power to do so. The regents of Ptolemy, having summoned the populace to an assembly, promised to bring the war to a speedy end, and this at least they were not in error, since they swiftly succeeded in putting an end to both the war and to themselves." End quote. So here in Diodorus, we have yet another example of Daniel 11 perfectly aligning with our historical sources. It's really quite remarkable how accurate Daniel 11 is. So with that, we're going to end this video that covers verses 25 and 26. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. As always, if you're enjoying these videos, your support would be greatly appreciated. So please consider supporting me on Patreon. Find the link in the description below. Patrons will receive early access to my videos, specifically for the next few videos in which I'll be discussing the 6th Syrian War. I'm going to be releasing a few at once for my patrons, simply because I believe it's important to get all this information in one shot and not in dribs and drabs. So please become a Patreon if you're enjoying this content and you want to get some early access as well. But if donating isn't something you're able to do, it's still tremendously helpful if you hit that like button and leave a comment. And finally, make sure you're subscribed to get my next video. Thank you for watching until the end, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.